morning we're going on a bus trip. It's called the Civil War Sampler Tour. We're going to ride a Newton's bus down to Richmond, Virginia, and pick up a tour guide and ride around for about 2 hours in the city. We're going to tour some battlefields today before we head back to Tappahannock.
You guys are from the Essex area, right? And this is done by the Essex County Museum. Is that right? Where's that specifically at? Is that in Tappahannock?
It is on Water Lake.
Okay. All right. Well, have you guys had any experience with Civil War action up in that area in Essex? Was there much in the way of fighting up in that area during the Civil War? Very little? Because I've had some fighting up there myself. I know getting a table at Lowry's once was a real problem for us. And then I got into a kind of a verbal argument with a minor bird at Lowry's, and I lost that one, unfortunately. But anyway, I love that area, and be really glad to have you guys here. I assume all of you have probably been down to Richmond once or twice before. You're not forced to stay there all the time. So I assume you've probably been in the area. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be using about a 4-hour ride through Richmond, and we'll get out of a couple places, but not too many, just a few. One of them a major battlefield, and then also we'll stop at what they call Tredegar Ironworks. If you haven't been to that, it's a pretty neat location. The thing is, I wanted to try and give everybody that's on the tour as some appreciation of what people went through 150 years ago with the Civil War experience. It was, I think, one of the more horrific experiences that anybody could go through in our country's history. I can't think of anything that's really been more traumatic, but that also had some excellent results. For example, the end of slavery. I mean, it ended that one. Another one was that I think it made a difference as far as the future of the country regarding whether we were going to be an agrarian republic, kind of the way Jefferson wanted us to be, or if we were going to be industrialized state. Industrialized state won on that. And we stayed that way through much of the 20th century. That's the way it turned out. First off, we're going to go through the city. We're going to go through to the east end of the old part of Richmond, and we're going to go through the west, and we'll out and see Monument Avenue. We'll just come back along Monument Avenue once we get past the statuary, and drive up from 7th Street, which is actually a lot more scenic than what I normally do, but it will take a bit longer. Okay? Right now, where we're at is called Court End, and they call this little neighborhood Court End because not only were there a lot of courts in this area throughout the history of Richmond, but this was also where a lot of judges and lawyers lived. Many of these homes were occupied by lawyers. The building over here, the Richmond History Center, the Valentine History Center, that's not just the 1 or 2 buildings out here. It's the entire block of buildings. If you haven't been in there, try that sometime. This is an urban museum. It's not devoted specifically to the Civil War. It's basically an urban museum dedicated to talking about the history of Richmond. Now, this view gives me a place to talk a little bit about the Civil War issues. If you look down, you might be able to see some of the leaves have already fallen. In the river down below, you may see some large granite boulders. This is where the falls of the James begins, is right in this area. Rocket's Landing, the place where people used to unload ships and board ships, is up to our left a little bit near the where those grain elevators are today. Because this is the location that William Byrd decided looked an awful lot like Richmond on the Thames. And there's a sign down here pointing out a picture as we drive away. You'll probably see that. It does look quite a bit like that location in England. So I can see where he came up with the idea. Byrd was quite a traveler, and he got over to England several times. He was educated in England, for that matter. But now the river itself, as it widens further east of us, that's where the ships were able to move in here. Prior to the Civil War, we would have seen located up in front of us, maybe 50 ships waiting at anchor to load or unload cargo. When the Civil War got really moving and it was in full swing with the Union blockade in force, maybe 5 ships would have been placed down there at one time. And many of those could not get out the way they hoped to. They had blockade runners and cargo vessels down there, but it was really tough as the war wore on because the Union blockade got more and more stressful throughout the South. In fact, by the end of the Civil War, the Union Navy was the largest navy in the world. Now we're coming down off of Church Hill gradually now, and we're going to be moving down into the Shockoe Bottom area, by the way. And the building on our left, which we're going to go past here in a second, that's called Boley Brothers paper box company, basically. That was the second Alabama hospital during the Civil War. A lot of the buildings were more or less taken over or purchased by other Confederate states at the time the war started, and they were intended to be used as hospitals for troops from that particular state. The building that we're going to go into is the one over here with the two colors of brick on our right. The one behind us is a pay museum called the American Civil War Center. But the one on immediate right is the one that's run the Park Service runs. While the South was outmanned, they were also outgunned because of the numbers of guns that were made in the North. However, this particular facility, this has some damage in it, but none of this was caused by combat. There was no fighting in Richmond at the time of the Civil War. Much of the damage you see here was from natural causes, fires or flooding with the James River right out here. The folks that own this building are the ones that own the white building on the hill. The Ethel now Newmarket Corporation. They own all this property. They basically rented out to these two museums so that people can see what happened here years and years ago. It's great of them to do that. But the facility itself operated from 1937 to 1957. It was after the Civil War. The person who owned the facility, Joseph Reed Anderson, asked that the Confederates not destroy it. They'd be allowed to keep the facility. They agreed to that. So he also took, there's only about 5 acres here, but it was the largest industrialized location in the entire South. He positioned people that worked for him, called the Tredegar Battalion, as he named them, around the outer edges of the facility, kept the rioters from coming in and doing more damage to it before Union troops could occupy the city. But it was to his credit that the facility actually came back after the war and managed to survive for all those years, all the way up to 1957. He lived to about 1892. I think he died up in New Hampshire, a place he had up there. But quite a guy. He kept things rolling in here, even though a lot of their natural materials were cut off from them because of Union blockades and because of politics. Like a lot of their materials came from Pennsylvania prior to the Civil War. They had to rely during the war more and more on iron they got from the Shenandoah Valley. There were 7 furnaces out in the Shenandoah Valley that supplied this location during the war. One of them not so hot because they tried to make a few cannons out of that iron. They blew up on them. So they stopped using that iron for that purpose. But the other 6 did proceed through the war. He had around normally about 1,000 people working at this facility. He ended up purchasing all 7 of those furnaces in Shenandoah Valley, one of which had been owned by his own brother.
What they called forges at that time. There are a lot of places called Clifton Forge,
sometimes,
Providence
yes,
Forge,
right.
and all those
That's where those kinds of names come from. But these furnaces that he eventually purchased, he ended up with 1,500 employees at those. So he had around 2,500 people working for him at the peak of war production. And as time went on, more and more of those employees became African American. He had about 40 or 50 when the war started. By the end of the war at this facility, around 500 of the 1,000 that were here were African American workers.
We can see that it was a Union gun. But yeah, these are Civil War era guns, just like the ones at Tredegar. They are actual originals, not the carriage around it, just the barrel itself is original, of course. But how do we know this is Union gun without looking at the name of the foundry or anything, guys? That's right. We're picking this up. Great. One of the Rangers has told me the reason the Union guns had a flare in them was because they like to ship them on board ships sometimes. That was a place to get a rope around, to get an easier way to load them up into cargo. That's possible. Another thing I think of is I think maybe they thought there was a little more strength at the muzzle when the gun was fired. And that may have been another reason, I'm not sure. But at any rate, like I said, these were the favorite weapon of both armies. The range of a Napoleon, 1857 model Napoleon 12-pounder, they called it, because it fired a 12-pound round shot. That was a little around a mile accurate. The balls went further than that, but that was the accurate range, they figured. And these things, when they were fired, they would kick back about 6 feet. So every time you fired them, you had to reorient them to aim them all over again. A really good gun crew could fire one of these once every 30 seconds. And there was normally a gun crew of about 6 people, and then you had an additional half a dozen people to watch over the horses, the limber, and the ammunition wagons and that sort of thing. So it took up at least a 12 people crew to keep one of these going. They were normally in batteries of 3. So here you have 36 people working with these 3 guns. It took up a lot of manpower. Now, in effect, they made a lot of noise. They were the terror weapon of the Civil War. They would fire round balls, but that was to knock things down. For troops, if they were firing it at infantry or cavalry, either one, they were firing explosive shells. They would have a fuse in the end of the shell that would be lit when it came out of the barrel by the flame around it. And that would be fired off in order to explode, either with powder in it or in case shot. Had actual metal balls in there that would rain down, was the preferred way to happen, would rain down on top of troops. And the fuses were set for 4 seconds, 10 seconds, that sort of thing. They weren't always that accurate. Sometimes they wouldn't go off at all, of course. There were duds, and they still find duds around from that era. Yes. That's the Tredegar. It's not really Tredegar, because this wasn't made in Tredegar. This is